Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting lecture in the course. And here today we're going to zoom ahead in time and examine the next time period under review, the Progressive Era. In our most recent lecture, we examined the Gilded Age, a period from the late 1870s through the early 1890s, and we noted some of the problems that developed in American society during that Gilded Age, most importantly, a growing disparity between a few who are very rich and the many who were living lives of desperation and poverty, indebtedness. For racial minorities, they faced all sorts of processes of exclusion, racism, racialized violence. And so it really was a period of haves and have-nots. And for some, that growing divide could be smoothed over, reconciled by the doctrine of social Darwinism, which we examined in our final slides on our lecture on the Gilded Age. It was an ideology that for some served to justify the growing disparity between haves and have-nots, but for other Americans, the Gilded Age and the problems it presented could not be addressed by the ideology of social Darwinism. Instead, many people rejected the fatalism, the determinism of social Darwinism, and they imagined the possibility of progress, change, reform, remedying the problems that plagued America in the Gilded Age. They were not convinced that it's simply a world of the fit and the unfit, and instead they aspired to change America, and that led to the period we examine here today, the Progressive Era, which is one of many moments of reform in American life, where the nation as a whole is excited by the possibility of change. We turn our attention to the story of the Progressive Era here today, as we examine the response of many Americans to the inequities and problems of the Gilded Age as Americans embraced progress, change, reform. Our goal here is today to understand the Progressive Era as a time of America enlivened by reform, the reforms that did come, and sadly, tragically, the reforms that did not come, even in this period of great hope for change. Let's begin our study of the Progressive Era with William Dean Howells. William Dean Howells will be our entry point into a shift in sensibility that marks the end of the Gilded Age and the beginning of the Progressive Era. A change in sensibility where Americans came to believe in the hopes of progress and reform. William Dean Howells was an acclaimed American writer, novelist of the late 19th century, the period we're now examining. In fact, he was really the very first American writer to receive a great deal of acclaim, appreciation, recognition in Europe, in the hallowed halls of Paris, Vienna, London. He was accepted as a true literary figure. So many of the American writers of the 19th century that you're probably familiar with, that we often see as the great American writers of this period, Mark Twain, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, they weren't considered great writers in Europe at the time in which they were alive. One of the terrible tragedies of being a great artist is sometimes you're not appreciated until you're dead and unable to enjoy the recognition that comes with that acclaim. Vincent van Gogh sold one painting, just one, in his lifetime. If he were alive today and could see Starry Night on every mouse pad and mug, he'd say, oh, great, now you love me, right? So quite often, writers, painters, artists aren't appreciated until they're gone. William Dean Howells was the exception to that. He was a writer that enjoyed a great deal of acclaim when he could actually appreciate it. He was really the first American writer to receive a great deal of recognition as a true literary figure, a true novelist in the bastions of culture in Europe. William Dean Howells was an acclaimed writer, and his writings at this time serve again as a good entry point into what's happening in the 1880s and 1890s as the Gilded Age is undergoing a series of critiques and new ways of thinking. New sensibilities are germinating that will build into this Progressive Era, this moment of reform in America. The first great novel of Howells that we can mine here as evidence of a shift in American culture, opening the door to this Progressive Era, is The Rise of Silas Lapham. And as the title indicates, The Rise of Silas Lapham is a rags to riches story. It's a story of a man who invents a machine and enjoys great wealth, great acclaim. It's the rise of Silas Lapham. We talked in our lecture on the Gilded Age about how rags to riches stories were part of the social Darwinist ethic of this time. It was a way of thinking about poverty, people's ability to rise out of poverty, that put the onus and burden on the individual. If you show up, work hard, don't complain, you can rise from rags to riches. It was a way of thinking about the world that undergirded and supported the existing economic system and urged people to blame individuals for their fate and insulated the system, the economy, from such critiques. So rags to riches stories are vital to the Gilded Age, to social Darwinism, to the idea that everyone's lot in life is a function of their own choices. But Howell's rags to riches story, the rise of Silas Lapham, is very different, and that's why we can draw upon it as evidence of a shift in sensibilities and American culture in this period among intellectuals like Howells. Silas Lapham gets rich. He gets rich inventing a machine, the great dream of a Gilded Age, a new industrial era. But he remains a buffoon, an idiot. The entire book is about how this guy gets rich, goes around the world, and just reveals that he's a fool. Yeah, he may be rich, but he's not better. He's not more fit. In fact, he's an idiot. Being rich doesn't mean you're better, more successful, more admirable. And so the rise of Silas Lapham was a skewering of the rags to riches story. It was a skewering, a critique of the idea that simply being rich means you're better, more fit. It was a critique of the idea that we should celebrate rich people in a social Darwinist way that argued the rich owe the poor nothing, and the poor owe the rich everything. But the masterwork of William Dean Howells was his short novel published in 1894 at this pivot point of America, moving out of the Gilded Age and into the Progressive Era, known as The Traveler from Algeria. And maybe this is the best evidence I can offer to you about how American attitudes, particularly among educated elites, are shifting in this period, away from the fatalism, determinism of social Darwinism that was key to the Gilded Age, and to the possibility of change and reform that will define the Progressive Era. Travel from Algeria is a little bit of science fiction for some of you sci-fi types. It's about a person from another planet, from the planet of Algeria, who crash lands in America in the 1890s. He gets out of his spaceship, and he looks around, and he says, "What is this place, America?" And he sees a world where a few are very rich, and the many who work for them, who labor for them, are desperately poor. He sees what we saw in the photographs of Jacob Riis, a world where people are living in tenement buildings, children are sleeping in the streets. And then he sees a political class, politicians, who could do something about this, but instead are in league with, in partnership with the rich, whose policies are geared towards preserving a world where few are very rich and the many are desperately poor. Traveler from Algeria exits his spaceship and he sees this great disparity in wealth. He also sees people who hate other people because of the color of their skin, the religion that they adhere to, or the country that they came from. He sees what we described in our lecture on the Gilded Age, an America of haves and have-nots. And the traveler from Algeria is shocked by this. He says, back where I come from in Algeria, nobody's poor. Nobody goes without an education. Nobody hates someone because of the color of their skin or the religion they adhere to. Traveler from Algeria is shocked that there's some place in the universe where such deprivation, misery exists. And confronted with this place, America, that he has found himself in, he makes a choice. He decides that wherever he sees suffering, misery, deprivation, he's going to extend love and compassion. And he goes around America with this mission of love and compassion, and a strange thing happens. People, the poor, racial and religious minorities, people had long been subject to misery, deprivation, violence, racism. They respond to this strange person, this traveler from Algeria, who extends love and compassion to them, who seems to indicate they do matter, even if they're not rich and powerful. And they join with the traveler from Algeria, and a big movement swells and grows, and they too spread love and compassion, love and compassion. Even the rich, even the powerful are moved by this strange man who's made this commitment to change. And they too join with the traveler from Algeria. The traveler from Algeria is able to persuade them to reach into their pockets, spend money, build schools, hospitals, put people to work. And at the end of this novel, All the problems that the traveler from Altaria saw when he exited his spaceship had been solved. No longer a world of haves and have-nots. Traveler from Altaria is sometimes described as a utopian novel. Utopia is a word we use in English to describe a perfect world. And the traveler from Altaria imagines that America could become a perfect world. And that's why it's such a great resource for us for understanding this new period, the Progressive Era that we focus on in this lecture, where there's this belief in America that reform and change is both necessary because we have problems in this country, crime, poverty, illiteracy, a growing disparity between rich and poor, but also possible. And that's necessary to these moments in American history that are alive with reform, that are alive with change, as we've examined in this class and will continue to examine in this class when we confront other periods of reform. In order to have one of these moments that you have in the antebellum reform period, you have in the Progressive Era, you have in the New Deal era, and the Civil Rights eras that we'll talk about in lectures to come, you need two necessary beliefs. One, that reform is necessary. You don't launch a crusade of reform if everyone's happy and everything's great. You need problems. But you also need this firm faith that problems could be solved. Traveler from Altaria dramatizes this in a novel. Traveler from Altaria gets out of his spaceship, he sees a problem, and he makes a choice. What's the meaning of that novel? One person can change the world. That the way things are isn't how they have to be. If we want a better America, we can make it so. We can materialize that better world if we just make that choice. And Americans, confronted with the inequities and problems that plagued the nation in the Gilded Age, said, the way things are isn't how they have to be. And that's why we begin this lecture with the tutelary example of William Dean Howells, who was an American writer at this key moment where ideas are changing, sensibilities are changing. Some Americans were ready to reject the fatalism and determinism of social Darwinism that said, well, it's just a matter of fit and unfit. Some will succeed, others will be left behind. That's a good thing, that's progress. Instead, progressives who will launch this campaign that will span 2 decades in the Progressive Era will say, no, the way things are is not how they have to be. And that ushers in this period, the Progressive Era, that roughly spans 20 years, from 1896 to America's entrance into World War I in 1917. It is one of 4 moments in American history where the nation as a whole is alive, enthused by the possibility of reform. There was the antebellum reform period of the early 19th century, which launched efforts like abolitionism, the effort to end slavery, feminism, public school movement, labor movements. The 1830s, 1840s, 1850s was a moment where Americans believed that the way things are isn't how they have to be, and they aspired to brave and bold ways of thinking. They aspired to brave and bold forms of change, like ending slavery and creating a new America where blacks and whites were equal, where men and women were equal. Then there's this moment that is our focus in this lecture, the Progressive Era, where once again the nation, confronted with problems, will seek reform. And then again later in the class we'll talk about the 2 other great moments of reform in American history, the New Deal, the response to the Great Depression, and then the post-World War II civil rights efforts of racial equality, gender equality, a more generous vision of America. So the Progressive Era is one of these moments. We begin the Progressive Era in 1896 because that was the year of a presidential election where both the Democratic nominee for president and the Republican nominee for the presidency embraced reform and using the federal government in new ways to reform the inequities and problems in American life. When we talked about the Gilded Age, when we talked about, in particular, social Darwinism and its very fatalistic, deterministic way of thinking that said, well, some are fit, some are unfit, just the way things are, we also talked about a political philosophy that was embraced by both the Democratic and Republican parties known as laissez-faire, that complemented, worked well with social Darwinism. Laissez-faire was the political philosophy of the 1870s and 1880s. It said government should stay out of the economy, society, simply allow the forces of Darwinian competition to play out. But in 1896, you had a big shift that makes this really one of the points that we can indicate a political and social cultural change alongside novels like A Traveler from Algeria, because in 1896, both major parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, nominated candidates who came out in the cause of reform. The Republican Party nominated William McKinley, and when McKinley ran in 1896, he said, "I will do things to solve the problems that plague America." An anti-laissez-faire message. And the Democratic nominee, William Jennings Bryan, was even more forceful in his call for radical efforts to use the government to address these problems that plagued America. So they were responding to a hunger. They were responding to a great demand in America for change, for the government to step in and do something. In the 1880s, 1890s, there were labor movements. There were third parties like the Populist Party that voiced this frustration, this anger that government wasn't responsive. And the major parties took that challenge seriously, and they embraced this idea of reform. And that's why I'm establishing the Progressive Era as beginning in that fateful election of 1896, where both major parties were fielding candidates for the highest office in the land that advocated for using the government in a way that would address the problems, the frustrations that Americans felt that often urged them to embrace labor unions and the Populist Party, other third parties that were advocating for a much more interventionist role than laissez-faire allowed. Progressive Era comes from the widespread problems and discontent in America. This is a necessary ingredient in a time of reform, in these 4 moments of reform that we examine in American history. You need a sense of discontent. You don't launch a major effort to reform society if everyone's happy, if everything's fine. If you want one of these reform moments, if you aspire to change, you need these 2 necessary ingredients. 1, a sense that something is wrong, something is amiss, something is problematic in America. This was the effort of muckrakers like Jacob Riis, who wanted to grab America by the throat and say, look, this is going on in your country. What are we going to do about it? We've got children sleeping in the streets. We've got true deprivation. And wherever Americans looked, despite the gilded exterior of the Gilded Age, despite skyscrapers and department stores and new wonders and gadgets, there were widespread problems in America. But in addition to a cognizance and awareness that problems exist, the other necessary ingredient that you need in a time of reform is a true faith that reform is possible. Right now in America, in this moment, I think we can all agree people are angry, frustrated, discontented. Many people see government as unresponsive to the many problems that plague our nation today. Another growing disparity between rich and poor, climate change, housing crises, homelessness. You don't have to work too hard to see problems in America today, but we don't have this other necessary ingredient, a sense that it's possible to change, that we can solve this. In fact, there's a great deal of fatalism and cynicism in America that we can't do great things anymore. What we really need is not just a sense that there are problems, but what did prevail in the Progressive Era, the idea that we can solve them. And in the Progressive Era, the second necessary ingredient for an age of reform, this idea that we can solve problems, manifest in a great appreciation for science and technology and reason and rationality as the mechanisms that can bring change. If you need, in a time of reform, both a sense that something is wrong, but also an abiding faith that reform is possible, well, in the Progressive Era, that latter ingredient, that second ingredient, came in an appreciation and hope for the power of science, reason, rationality, and technology to usher in a more equitable America. This is the one thing that the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era have in common. The Gilded Age had a great appreciation for science, technology. It was a new age of skyscrapers and engines and machines and gadgets and gizmos. And with it came this idea of a new modern age dawning. This is what enlivened and excited the new possibilities of an industrial age. Social Darwinism, though it was a pseudoscience, claimed to be scientific, and tried to foist its ideology upon Americans based on that appreciation for science as a marker, a measure of truth. So we already established that the Gilded Age had a great commitment to science, reason, rationality, technology. The Progressive Era, though a critique of the Gilded Age, also believed that science is powerful, is an arbiter and measure of truth. But if we harness that power of science, we can make a better America. So this is the one way in which the Gilded Age and Progressive Era have a point of continuity. They both believed in the magic, the power of science. Progressives, though, said we could harness that power, that magic, to solve the problems that plague America. In the Gilded Age, some might say, well, this scientific way of thinking, this pseudo-false science of social Darwinism says you can't do anything. It's just simply a matter of fit and unfit. Progressives said, no, we can take the power of science and solve poverty, crime, illiteracy. We can make a more equitable America. So this is a period in American history where Americans are increasingly coming to see science, reason, rationality, technology as remarkable forces. And for progressives, that power, that might, can be used to make a better America. So this too accounts for the origins as well as the character of the Progressive Era. The strong faith, this abiding faith that reform is not just necessary but possible. And seeing science, reason, rationality, the forces that were transforming American life, allowing us to blow up mountains, send railroads right through them, allowing us to build skyscrapers that defied the limits of gravity. If we could just take that power, we could make a better America. Now, one of the problems with the Progressive Era, problems in a class like this where we have to cover so much history in so limited amount of time, is that we tend to talk about progressives as one group of people. But they're not a monolith. They disagreed with each other. They often offered very different pathways of reform and change. And one of the big themes of this lecture is the many different forms of reform. We will soon, in slides to come, talk about what reform could mean and how it manifests, and also the ways in which it failed. So it's key to note, even though we have to cover decades of history here in this one lecture and many decades of history in the totality of this course, that progressives were a motley mix of people from different backgrounds, different points of view, and they didn't always agree, and they didn't always advance the cause of reform for all. It's better to think about progressivism as sort of an elastic, expansive idea that many people from different backgrounds could latch onto and pursue very different policies and ends, leading to many different forms of reform. Reform taking hold, taking root in different ways. Reform as a contagious idea, as something that could be embraced and appropriated by people from many different backgrounds and lead to ends that we today may not exactly see as progress or admirable forms of change. So progressive sensibilities are complicated. They were filtered through a very diverse America, comprised of people with different backgrounds, different priorities, different visions. And so the Progressive Era is, as a result, a complex time where things get markedly and appreciably better for many Americans. But also, it's a period where many Americans continue to be denied progress and reform. This is a period where, as we'll talk about, there is an amendment to the Constitution that's designed to allow all women to vote. But with that amendment, still many women couldn't vote. And that, in microcosm, is this other point I want to make here and throughout this lecture, that things change profoundly, but the other things don't change. White women could vote as a result of the 19th Amendment, but people of color, men or women, could not vote. Progressive Era is a time of remarkable change where the federal government intervenes in ways never seen before in the economy, trying to create an economy that works for the many rather than the few. It ushers in a role for the federal government that increasingly comes to root and materialize in the 20th century. But at the same time, there are so many people who are left out of reform. And as a result, the exclusionary elements that we saw in the Reconstruction period that denied rights and opportunity to African Americans, the exclusionary forces that prevailed in the Gilded Age, where Native Americans were forced onto reservations, well, they continue in the Progressive Era, making the Progressive Era complicated in the sense that some things change, some things don't, but also complicated in the way in which some are included in that vision of reform while others remain excluded. So I want you, as we go forward in the slides to come, think about all this complexity, how reform could mean different things to different people, how profound change could come, but also there'd be a lack of change. And revealing in that is who benefited from reform and who remained excluded. We call it the Progressive Era, and that seems to indicate this is a time of progress. And, as we'll soon see, undoubtedly, unreservedly, yeah, a lot of progress does happen in this period. But progress for whom? Who enjoys progress and who continues to be excluded from progress? That too has to be appreciated and understood in this complex period of the Progressive Era. Alrighty, with all of that as a way of understanding the Progressive Era, let's now get into what actually happens or doesn't happen in the Progressive Era. One of the things that happens in the Progressive Era is that the government intervenes in the economy in new ways. It really is a rejection of the laissez-faire philosophy that prevailed in the Gilded Age. And so one of the things that happens in the Progressive Era is a lot of legislation is passed in this period that really puts the government in a position to regulate the private economy, regulate this new industrial economy with an eye for the common good. Instead of an economy that works for the very few, let's regulate, let's reform the economy in a way that creates broader prosperity and opportunity. And consistent with the embrace of science, reason, rationality in the Progressive Era, the idea was to let experts make decisions about how to regulate the economy. And a good entry into that is the work of Thorstein Veblen, who we can mine much like we mined William Dean Howells earlier as an exemplar of this element of the Progressive Era, this idea that experts should be in institutions regulating the economy with an eye for the common good. In 1899, the turn of the century, Thorstein Veblen wrote his magnum opus, his masterwork, Theory of the Leisure Class. And this book offers an argument that, much like the novels of Howells, really demonstrate different attitudes, different sensibilities in this period regarding wealth, power. Theory of the Leisure Class is Veblen's masterwork, his magnum opus, and the title indicates that his discussion here will be the very rich, the haves of a have and have-not society. The term leisure class here is synonymous for the very wealthy because in 1899, when Veblen wrote this book, the only people who had leisure time, the only people who had time where they didn't have to work, were the very rich. This was, again, an age where most Americans worked 6 days a week, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. You didn't have leisure time. This idea of a weekend, that's a very modern development in American history. This idea of leisure time for all, again, it's very, very recent in our history. In 1899, in this period, the only people who have idle time are the rich. So leisure class here refers to not people on vacation, but it refers to the very wealthy, those who don't have to work. And Veblen examined them. And he argued that when rich people, this leisure class, have more money, when more wealth is concentrated in the hands of the John D. Rockefellers and Andrew Carnegies, that's bad for society because they waste their money. He argues in this book that rich people aren't smarter, more fit in a social Darwinist way. In fact, they spend their money in really wasteful ways. They spend their money to indulge their anxieties and fears, their status anxiety that someone else has more money than we do. He, as an example, indicated the way in which rich people buy walking sticks. They don't need walking sticks. They don't have a disability or physical impairment that means they need this. They just buy a walking stick to have a walking stick because it means I'm rich. He coined a phrase in this book that we still hear today. It's a very, very valuable concept for us today. Conspicuous consumption. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. Conspicuous consumption means buying something, not for its utility, not for its value, not for its worth, not as something you're going to use to accomplish something, but you buy something just to be conspicuous, just to say, look at me, I'm so goddamn rich. So Veblen's point was a society where more and more wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few is not a society that's progressing. It's a society that's regressing. He argues that the concentration of wealth in America is a sign of a diseased, flawed economy. This isn't Darwinian competition playing out where these people have proven to be so much smarter and better and more fit, and so they get all this money. No, he argued that what we have is a society that's concentrated so much wealth in the hands of people who waste it on silly, stupid shit, like walking sticks they don't need. A better society, a more progressive society, would be one in which wealth is more equitably distributed. That's progress. And so Veblen's point was, if you look at America in 1899, at this point where, again, the Progressive Era is still beginning and germinating, we're not progressing. We're not going to launch into this new century, the 20th century, as a society that's going forward. We have a diseased, flawed society where we've concentrated so much wealth, not in smarter people, not in people who are good stewards of the economy, not in the hands of people who will invest and grow the economy, but in the hands of people who indulge in conspicuous consumption. What we need is instead an economy that works for the many. And this is a big part of the Progressive Era. Veblen is the founder of what's known as institutional economics. Institutional economics is the idea that you need various institutions in the economy that work for a common goal and common good. Institutional economics argues we should create institutions in government to counter the disparities in wealth, counter the power that's in the hands of a few individuals and large corporations. Create institutions in government that can regulate the economy with an eye for the common good. Those institutions should be powerful. They should be able to impose and intervene on the private interests of a few, the titans of industry in this period. And most importantly, those institutions should be staffed by, comprised of experts. Veblen had a PhD in economics. He was an economist, an historian, a professor. He said, people like me should be in charge. And we should create institutions in government that allow us to use our expertise in a way that will create not a diseased, flawed economy, but a progressive, advancing, forward economy. He argued that if you allow the Carnegies, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts to run the economy, well, you'll get an economy that works for the Carnegies, Rockefellers, and Vanderbilts. You'll get an economy that concentrates wealth in the hands of a few. What instead you should do is create institutions in government to regulate the economy for the common good. Why have I spent so much time on Thorstein Veblen? Because he too was an academic PhD like me? Well, no. Because he had great influence. His ideas did not remain in the ivory tower. They did not remain in this book that nobody read. Instead, his books were widely read by people in power, and he persuaded people. And ultimately, institutional economics manifests in this period. 1901, Theodore Roosevelt becomes president as a result of an assassination. William McKinley won that fateful election of 1896, but he'd be assassinated in 1901, and Teddy Roosevelt, the vice president, became president, at the time the youngest president. Now, as we'll talk about in a lecture coming soon, Teddy Roosevelt was a social Darwinist when it came to foreign policy. As we'll talk about in our next lecture, he led an effort to march around the globe, fight wars, take colonies, because he saw people beyond the borders of the United States as unfit. He also had a very social Darwinist attitude towards many racial minorities in America, including Native Americans. So in some ways, he was a social Darwinist when it came to people of color, both within and outside the United States. But in terms of domestic politics, he was a progressive, and he believed very much in this idea of using the government to intervene in the economy, to put experts in charge, to establish institutions that could regulate the economy with an eye for the common good. So Teddy Roosevelt may have been a social Darwinist in his foreign policy, but in his domestic policy, he was a progressive. In fact, he'll eventually form a third party called the Progressive Party. And so Veblen's ideas now influencing figures like Roosevelt, who would become president in 1901, lead to true change and reform in this period. For example, in 1906, Congress passes and Roosevelt signs into law the Pure Food and Drug Act that put the government in the position of establishing standards, sanitary standards, for what was now an industrial product, food. In a previous lecture, we talked about how Gustavus Swift industrializes meat production in America. And that meant that now things like meat, bread, mass-produced in big bakeries. Now food was an industrial product. But a lot of the food that was produced in the Gilded Age was dangerous, misleading in terms of its contents. The Pure Food and Drug Act was designed to remedy that, where the government will establish standards for what could be sold, what could be included in ingredients for food, and sanitary conditions that all producers of food must meet. Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was inspired by another muckraker, another troublemaker, meddlesome journalist who exposed what was going on in meatpacking plants in America in the early 20th century. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle, which was an expose of meatpacking plants, where he detailed that these meatpacking plants were letting rats and roaches run through the packing plant. Now, that was designed to clean up, actually, in the factories where hot dogs and sausages and bacon were being produced. Rather than hire a cleanup crew that would clean up those meatpacking plants, that would cost money, you'd have to hire people. A lot of these meat packers, like Gustavus Swift and Oscar Mayer and Philip Armour, just let rats run through the factory. And rats are really good for cleaning up, right? A little bit of meat falls on the floor, they come and eat up all the meat. But the problem was the rats were falling into the big vats of meat. They were shitting everywhere, so you get rat turds in your hot dog. And so the meat was contaminated. Teddy Roosevelt read this book, and he said, it turned my stomach, and he became a vegetarian briefly because he didn't want to eat meat. The nation was shocked, much like they were shocked by the photographs of Jacob Riis in regards to what they were eating. Now, if you leave it up to the profit motive of meat packers like Gustavus Swift, hey, no problem letting rats run through your factory because, again, you don't have to pay a rat. It increases your profit. But the Gilded Age and the efforts of Roosevelt and Veblen instead prioritize the common good. It's not good for the collective health of the nation if we're eating rat turd hot dogs. It was very common when white bread was being mass-produced in this period that bakers would include plaster, sawdust in the bread and sell it as a healthy, wholesome product. Well, the Pure Food and Drug Act was designed to remedy that. It required that minimum standards be met. It regulated what could be included as ingredients in mass-produced products. It empowered the federal government to inspect certain products produced. If later today you have lunch and you do something really terrible to your body, like eat Hot Pockets or some other frozen disaster, right? Before you discard the box of the frozen pizza or pizza rolls or where the hell you're going to eat soon, take a look at that box. And if it contains a meat, you'll see that that particular box bears a stamp from the Department of Agriculture, a federal agency that says the meat packing plant where this was produced has met the standards. And that's there on your package of Hot Pockets or whatever the hell to make you, the consumer, aware that the product you're about to consume is safe and can be consumed. So that is a modern day example of the consequences of this more interventionist role in the economy and government. In 1906 as well, Congress passed and Roosevelt signed into law the Hepburn Act that empowered the federal government to use the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, as a federal agency to regulate railroads and establish what railroads could charge for their products. So there is this effort to now again use the federal government to regulate a business that was so central to the new industrial America. Railroads, we talked a lot in our recent lecture about the railroad industry, a new national marketplace for goods, how railroads were circulating, crisscrossing the nation, how they were vital to a new economy that centered on a national marketplace for goods. A lot of Americans felt gouged and exploited by railroads, farmers in particular, that were now dependent on railroads to get their crops to market. If you lived in a rural area and you were a farmer, there might only be one railroad in town, and you had to use that railroad. And the owner of that railroad knew you needed to use the railroad, that it was a vital resource. And he also knew that there was no competition. It was the only railroad in town in Speed Bump, Kansas, or whatever far-flung rural area we may be describing. As a result, he would gouge and exploit farmers and ranchers and others that were dependent on this new industrial economy and this key part of it, railroads. Well, the Hepburn Act allowed the federal government to set rates. It would tell railroaders how much they could or could not charge for access to their key resource. Now, that again demonstrates federal government in an interventionist role, deciding what is a fair and unfair price, imposing that upon industrialists. It's very demonstrative of, again, this element of the Progressive Era, Veblen's influence, institutional economics. The federal government is now going to tell railroaders what they can and cannot charge for accessing their service. It's designed to, again, look out for the little guy, the common guy, the farmer, the rancher, that is dependent on limited railroad access and resources. So there's so much here that, again, speaks to this key element of the Progressive Era. But it's important to note that though this is an imposition on the Cornelius Vanderbilts and Leland Stanfords of the world, the owners of railroads, that it ultimately proves to be a benefit to them, a boon to them. In the Progressive Era, the federal government took a much more regulatory interventionist role. The government came in and told meat packers that they have to clean up their plants. It told them what they could and could not include in their products, with, again, an eye for safety and sanitary conditions, the common good, an eye for consumers not to be ripped off and cheated. It came in and told railroaders what they could and could not charge. Yes, this is a period where the government is much more interventionist, regulating business. But one of the things to be mindful of in this period, and other periods we'll examine, and today, businesses often benefit from this regulation. We hear a lot of critics today, still in America, those from a more laissez-faire point of view. It says government should stay out of the economy. Too much regulation is bad for the economy. Well, history is the remedy to that idea. History is the counter-example of actual factual information that reveals actually when businesses are regulated, they do better. Guess what? When you regulate railroads in a way that sets rates, well, more people can afford to use railroads. And they increasingly incorporate railroads into their operations and their businesses. More customers. When you regulate meat and bread, you're telling consumers this is safe to buy. You won't die if you eat this hot dog. Guess what? People buy more hot dogs and more bread. So the Progressive Era didn't halt the industrialization of America. It actually expanded it. Though the Progressive Era is often motivated by a suspicion about big business, a sense that big business is exploitative, cruel, responsible for great disparities in wealth, instead, the Progressive Era proved to be a great boon to factories and industrialists in this period. Another example of experts and institutions regulating the economy for the common good, child labor laws are now finally established in America that prohibit businesses from hiring children. We've talked in previous lectures about how children were very often employed by industrialists in this period. They were often preferred because they could be paid less. They were imagined to be more obedient, more tractable as employees, less likely to form a union and go on strike. And so there are many reasons why industrialists like to hire children, and families often had to send their children out to work, even though they worked in very dangerous conditions, because most Americans in this period lived lives of massive deprivation and desperation, poverty, indebtedness. They had a family income where you needed not just grandma and grandpa to work, but little Timmy and little Sally just to put food on the table. But in the Progressive Era, we finally established laws that said, no, you can't do that. That said, we as a society have higher interests here. Again, the common good. It might be in the interest of a few businessmen to hire children, But what about the future of this nation? Rather than have children working for a pittance on the factory floor, they should be in school learning. And this too, of course, is an example of how such regulations later had a larger benefit: a more educated society, a more capable, trained society, a more literate society. So many consequences came from child labor laws that prohibited hiring children, and then with it, mandatory education laws that said children should not be on the factory floor, they should be in the classroom. Because we as a society have higher interests beyond the narrow profit motive of industrialists. And with a more educated population, with a more literate population, well, ultimately this proved to be very beneficial to the American economy. So there's a lot here about how, again, this is part of the common good. So one key aspect of the Progressive Era is this way in which, in this period, the government does more, the way in which the government intervenes in the economy. Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. He very much believes in this idea established by Veblen and other thinkers, and it leads to real reform and real change. But it doesn't end in America of haves and have-nots. As I've already indicated, in many ways this was a great benefit and boon to industrialization. When the Progressive Era ends, we still have an America where a few are very rich and the many are desperately poor. But what does happen in the Progressive Era is that the people on the underside of the American economy have a more legible, reliable economy. There are institutions to counter the power of corporate America. There are developments within industrial America itself that are designed to improve the lot of life for Americans. Henry Ford embraces the $5 workday in 1913, doubling the wages of his workers. He did this not because he was a kind and generous guy, but because he realized that if workers have more money, they'll spend more money, and more people will buy my cars. He famously said, "I want the man making the Model T to be able to buy the Model T." So paying your workers more, that's good, because it all comes back to benefit industrialists. So though this doesn't end the great disparity in wealth, though in many ways proves to undergird and support further industrialization of America, the regulations and reforms in this period create a more legible, reliable consumer economy. There are efforts to stave off unionization and labor militancy in this period. Pay your workers more, they'll be happier, they'll show up, they'll spend more. That improve markedly the experience of many people who, again, were the have-nots. So it's, again, a complex story where, yeah, great disparities in wealth continue, but there is some benefit to American workers and consumers that come with the government more involved in the economy. The second element of reform and change in this period that I want to note is in the form of politics. And this is a period where, by the end of the Progressive Era, a constitutional amendment will be ratified that's designed to allow half of the population who had been excluded from participating in political life to be included. The advent of the 19th Amendment, and with it, women's suffrage, women's right to vote. Now, the story of the ratification of the 19th Amendment is, of course, a long story that stretches back to that earlier period of reform in the antebellum age, the feminism that began in the 1830s, 1840s, that led to singular and key events like the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which was this effort by women then and men who supported the effort to secure the right to vote for women. But in the Progressive Era, there was greater and greater possibility for finally realizing what was a long-deferred dream, thanks to the emergence of a new archetype, a new image of American womanhood, the new woman. In the early 20th century, even in the late 19th century, young women were embracing this new vision of womanhood, the new woman for a new century. The new woman ideal, the new woman archetype, was an embrace of a new role for women as more active and interventionist in public, cultural, and social life. It was a rejection of that old separate spheres doctrine that prevailed in the Victorian age, that women should stay out of political and social concerns. Rejecting that was this new image of the new woman for the new century that embraced women, active, involved in politics, active and involved in social concerns. Women were instrumental and vital to the Progressive Era. They're leading campaigns like the temperance movement that will later lead to another amendment, prohibition. They're leading efforts to combat vice and prostitution. They're leading efforts to advance child labor laws and compulsory education for children. Women were very active in this, as we'll soon talk about in our lecture on World War I. They were active in the peace movement, trying to prevent America's involvement in that war, as well as very active in selling war bonds and trying to build support for the war. So though women could not vote in the early stage of the Progressive Era, they were deeply involved in social, political efforts as part of the Progressive Era, in line with this new image, this new archetype, the new woman for a new century. So one key boost to the cause of women's suffrage was this new embrace by many American women of this new archetype, this new image, the new woman for a new century, that embraced women involved in political and social causes, saw that as vital, rejected Victorian sensibilities that argued that women should be instead confined to the private or familial role of life. Women had a role in public and political life. That was the image of the new woman. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the cause for women's suffrage is a long cause in American history, going back to really the founding of the Republic, deepened and advanced in the antebellum era. And then after the Civil War, key suffragettes like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed a movement to advance a nationwide agenda to achieve the right to vote. In 1869, just 4 years after the Civil War ends, during a Reconstruction period that, as we talked about, was alive also with possibility and change, reimagining who is an American, what does it mean to be a citizen, ratifying amendments that changed American history. During that moment of Reconstruction in 1869, Stanton and Anthony form the National American Women Suffrage Association, the NAWSA. That's a mouthful, right? The National American Women Suffrage Association. We can abbreviate it as we have here, NAWSA. It was an effort to secure the right to vote for all American women during that Reconstruction period where we were reinventing citizenship, establishing equal protection of law under the 14th Amendment, and with the 15th Amendment allowing at least black men to vote. Initially, the NAWSA employed a state-by-state approach where they realized they had limited resources, they had a controversial point of view, women should vote, and they had to achieve that goal by convincing men to vote for women's suffrage. One of the things that explains why it took so long, so very long, for women to secure the right to vote was the only way to establish that was through legislation, meaning you have to pass laws. But the only people who could vote for legislators and the only people who tended to serve as legislators were men. So women had to convince men to elect people or pass laws that would grant women the right to vote. And so it was a very uphill battle. And because of that, the NAWSA, this group formed by Stanton and Anthony, decided to focus on one state at a time, a state-by-state approach. They said, look, we've got limited resources, we've got a controversial point of view, and we got to convince men to vote. And so they employed the state-by-state approach where they could concentrate their limited resources on one state at a time. And they had a lot of success in states that might surprise you today. States that today we tend to think of as very conservative. States in the Mountain West region like Montana, Colorado. They were some of the very first states to adopt women's suffrage. Why would states that today we think of as red states, culturally conservative, adopt women's suffrage? Well, they were trying to encourage women to go to those states and remedy an imbalance in men and women, the ratio of men to women. A lot of men went to states like Montana to work in railroading, mining, ranching, industries that selected for male labor. And they looked around and all they saw were other hairy, stinky men. And they said, well, it sure be great if some women showed up. How do we convince women to move to Colorado, Montana, Idaho, all of these states that, again, had an imbalance in gender ratios? I know, let's pass women's suffrage. Tell women they should come out here because they could vote, and then we could get married and get laid, right? So the very first states to adopt women's suffrage were often Western states that either were hotbeds of progressivism like California. California was also a state that adopted women's suffrage well before the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920, or Mountain West states that, again, were trying to attract single women to come out to those states and balance the gender imbalance that came with a population that was largely comprised of men. But after those early successes, the state-by-state approach began to break down because other states that did have a balance between the genders, other states that weren't so progressive-minded, balked at the idea of allowing women to vote. Now, women's suffrage was again very much in line with the Progressive Era idea about an America that works for the many, not the few, a more democratic America. When you deny half of the population the right to vote simply because they have a uterus, you don't really have a society that's progressing. You don't really have a society that's truly working for the many if half of the population can't vote. So, again, this long-standing effort that goes back to the founding of the Republic, the antebellum reform period, that grew out of Progressive Era causes really began to build in the early 20th century because it was a moment of reform. It was a moment of thinking larger. It was a moment of thinking about the many rather than the few, about a more democratic America. It was a moment where this new woman ideal was an increasingly powerful force in America. And into this comes the Congressional Union, which was another feminist organization made up of younger feminists, not veterans of 19th century efforts like Stanton and Anthony, that said we need a constitutional amendment. We need an amendment that in one fell swoop will establish the right to vote for American women in all states. Rather than focus on one state at a time, let's do it in one fell swoop. And that was a much more consistent message with what was going on in the Progressive Era, where the new woman ideal was increasingly embraced by a younger generation of women and feminists, where women were in the streets marching for change, leading crusades to combat the scourges of American society in this period, leading causes against alcohol. There was this temperance movement that eventually will flower into prohibition. More about that in lectures to come. And women were often very active in the temperance movement because women's interests were associated with the effort to curb the use or ban the use of alcohol, to protect women from domestic violence, to improve the standard of living of American women and American families. And so women were active in the temperance movement. They're on both sides of the debate of World War I. Some in the peace movement, some in the effort to sell war bonds and build patriotic support for the war. So wherever you looked in America in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, women were involved in politics and social debates. And the Congressional Union said, let's, on a national level, establish an amendment that will establish the right to vote, women's suffrage in all states. And that led the end of the Progressive Era, largely because of the sacrifices and efforts that women had made in World War I, in the war effort, in the home front, to ratify the 19th Amendment, which established that women can vote in all federal elections. What the 19th Amendment said was you could no longer discriminate based on sex in terms of voter registration and voter participation. We often celebrate the 19th Amendment as this key landmark event, and we should, because it did mark the fruition of a long-standing effort. During the Constitutional Convention in the 1780s, there were advocates then for women having the right to vote. Feminism is a long and central part of American history. Nothing more American than feminism. Feminism has been part of our history from our origins and, of course, continues to this day. And the 19th Amendment is a key moment where that long-standing vision really leads to true change. It's very demonstrative of how the Progressive Era was a time of progress where big, massive, important things happened. But the 19th Amendment, like the Progressive Era writ large, is a complicated animal. Because the best way to think about the 19th Amendment is not as giving women the right to vote, but giving white women the right to vote. Because all of the efforts that we talked about in previous lectures, our lecture on Reconstruction, literacy tests, poll taxes, understanding clauses, violence, intimidation at the polls, all that is still active and enforced in this period, meaning that women of color and people of color more broadly, including men, can't vote. So the best way to think about the 19th Amendment is that it allowed white women to vote. Because women of color, Native Americans, African Americans, as well as men of color, still face those literacy tests, those understanding clauses, The violence and intimidation of groups like the Klan that, as we'll talk about in lectures to come soon, is growing in power in this period, not receding in power. And so the Progressive Era is a complicated animal. It's a time where some things change and some things don't change. Where, yeah, the 19th Amendment is ratified so that women across this country can vote. We become a more progressive America, more democratic America. We can have a government that responds to millions of people who had been previously excluded. But still, others remain excluded even with the 19th Amendment. And that brings us to what I want to talk about now in the Progressive Era. Deepening this idea of a time of both change, reform, much of which we've testified to here, and a lack of change, continuity. The fact that so many racial minorities were left out of reform. You could see that in the 19th Amendment. 19th Amendment, strange, right? Because in one breath, it's this remarkable achievement for a more fair, just, and democratic America. But at the same time, it failed to secure the right to vote for both men and women of color, who still face all of those efforts. So a lot of what we've demonstrated already speaks to the way in which exclusion, racism, discrimination prevail in this period. And now let's deepen that in this slide where we talk about how so many racial minorities were kept out of progress. Why? Well, as we've already established, the Progressive Era was this period where we're thinking about reform, change in the eye of the common good. That's Thorstein Veblen's idea. That's the efforts to regulate business. Let's look out for the many, not just the few. Let's create an America that's more equitable, a society, a nation that is more reflective of the many, the few, rather than the few. Okay, well, if you think and work in those ways to create a more just society, if you think about an America that works for the many, not just for the few, if you think about progress for the common good, well, that demands that you imagine who the common is in the common good, who is a member of this nation, and who belongs in our society. If the Progressive Era was all about reform for the many, reform for a better nation, progress for the many, well, that demands that you imagine the nation, society, and the many. And what happens in the Progressive Era is that in that process of imagining the nation, the common good, some are included and others remain excluded. This is a big theme of the Progressive Era, and it's a big theme of this class. This question of who is an American. It is one of the cardinal and central elements of the argument without end that is our nation, its history, and its present. This question of who is an American, what do we mean by the first three words of the Constitution, we the people? Well, throughout our history, and still to this day, the answer to that question has meant some are included while others are excluded, and the Progressive Era is no exception. In this period, some people are increasingly included, women, white women, secure the right to vote, but things actually get worse for racial minorities. If it's a Progressive Era, that seems to indicate that it's a time of progress. Well, for some, yeah, but others, no. Good example of this, the Dead Indian Act of 1902. In 1902, Congress passed, and a progressive-minded president, Teddy Roosevelt, signed into law the Dead Indian Act. Now, look, first, just look at the name of this thing, right? If you're a Native American and you learn that Congress has passed the Dead Indian Act of 1902, that can't be good, right? And it wasn't good. What the Dead Indian Act of 1902 did was it allowed land that was now claimed by Native Americans as individuals to be sold at auction once that Native American died. We talked in our most recent lecture about the Dawes Act, passed in 1887, that was designed to encourage individual ownership of land by Native Americans. We talked about how that was a great disaster for Native Americans where they lost more land. The land that they did receive in those little allotments was then sold when they died under this Dead Indian Act. And the net result of this was more and more land, even more land, once claimed by Native Americans, was lost. The Dead Indian Act further accelerated the massive loss of land that came first with the Dawes Act and then even, of course, earlier with the story of westward expansion and wars of aggression against Native Americans that prevailed throughout American history. And so things get worse for Native Americans in the so-called Progressive Era. Why? Because Native Americans weren't imagined as part of the nation, as part of society, as part of the common good. So we're trying to do things in this period to engender and create progress. But at the same time, we're passing the Dead Indian Act of 1902 that saw more and more land gobbled up by outsiders, corporations, railroad mining interests, when land once owned by a Native American would be sold at auction, where it could be bought up by wealthy real estate speculators and others, meaning that things got worse for Native Americans, not better. And the reason why was Native Americans weren't first citizens of this nation in this period. Native Americans won't be granted citizenship for another 2 decades. And they weren't more metaphorically and culturally seen as members of this nation. This is a period where things get worse for African Americans. 1896 was the date that, in a previous slide, I said is the beginning date of the Progressive Era. And that's because of that fateful presidential election in 1896. 1896, though, was also the year that we talked about in a previous lecture of the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, which established through the Supreme Court this idea that was perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional, to segregate based on race in public life. And the point I made in that lecture was that decision in 1896 would open the door to another 60 years of apartheid in this country, where under laws enforced by local, state, and the federal government denied equality, access to education, employment, labor union membership. That was vital to improving the lives of African Americans. So the Progressive Era begins in the same year of Plessy versus Ferguson, meaning that the Progressive Era would be a period where this institutional racism, the institutional discrimination would be more vigorously enforced. So things don't get better, they get worse for African Americans in this period, as Jim Crow laws were cemented, as the Supreme Court in 1896 said you want to discriminate based on race and public life and education and employment and housing, go right ahead. Opening the doors to another 60 years of apartheid. That was the experience for African Americans. As a result, a new movement developed within African Americans to remedy this, and it was really led by W.E.B. Du Bois, who emerges in this period as the leading voice for civil rights and reform for African Americans. And he really began his career by critiquing Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was the most prominent black intellectual of the late 19th century, of the Gilded Age. And he was the very first African American actually to be welcomed to the White House as he had a meeting with Teddy Roosevelt, although he had to enter the White House not from the front entrance but from the back because of his race. And even though Roosevelt was criticized for having a black man at the White House, at the People's House, but the reason why Washington was embraced by Roosevelt and other white political figures was that Washington's argument was very consistent with the social Darwinist ethic. Washington argued that blacks should not work to aggressively confront racism. They should instead learn skills, learn trades, and be agents of their own uplift. Washington's argument was that the problem isn't the system itself and racism, but African Americans who need to educate themselves, need to learn trades, learn to find a place within the existing order rather than try to topple the existing order. And that was an argument that fit with the way in which social Darwinism put the onus on individuals, work hard, show up on time, you're the problem, not the system. And that's why white politicians like Roosevelt liked Washington and invited him to the White House. Du Bois, though, began his career critiquing Washington by arguing, no, it's not us, African Americans, that are the problem. Du Bois said, look, if we work hard, if we learn a trade, they still see us as inferior, and they still discriminate against us. It doesn't matter how hard you work. It doesn't matter how skilled and educated you are. You'll still be seen as inferior. The problem isn't us and our unwillingness to work and educate ourselves. The problem is racism. Du Bois was the very first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. He earned the highest degree possible from what is arguably seen as the greatest university in the nation, Harvard University. So he had the highest degree from the top university, and yet he could never find a job as a professor. Why? Because when he applied for jobs as a professor, he was discriminated against. People wouldn't hire him because, oh, you'll be too friendly to African Americans. When you write about African Americans, you'll portray them in a positive light. Yeah, that old canard, that actually you're the one who's going to be prejudicial. So Du Bois himself in his own life experienced this idea that it doesn't matter how hard you work, it doesn't matter how educated you are, you'll still be seen and solely seen as black. And he faced job discrimination. So this idea of Washington, that the problem was African Americans, they don't educate themselves, they don't work hard enough, they don't find a niche and place within the industrial economy, was assailed by Du Bois. And Du Bois launched his own effort, arguing that we're being left out of reform. And we need to launch an effort that says racism and discrimination, Jim Crow, is the problem. He argued that rather than try to fit in with the existing order, we need to confront the existing order and force true change. The problem is racism, not African Americans. He argued that in this moment of this progressive era, when there's so much possibility for change, we still remain excluded. And that's not our fault. It's the fault of the way in which we are not seen as true members of this nation. As critical as Du Bois was of the progressive era, in many ways he was deeply influenced by it, because he argued that this effort for civil rights would be led by people like him, educated elites, what he called the talented 10th, the top 10% of African American society, educated elites like himself. So he too believed in this idea that experts know better. Experts should lead reform. However, his reform was one of a more generous vision of America. And in doing so, he really set the template for the modern civil rights movement that will span the 20th century. Dr. King, Rosa Parks, Ralph Abernathy, A. Philip Randolph, the leaders that we'll soon talk about later in the class, who lead the modern civil rights movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they don't come out of nowhere. They, in many ways, stood on the shoulders of those who came before them, like Du Bois, who, in his critiques of Washington, really set a template going forward for the modern civil rights movement that will span the 20th and now into the 21st century, where he argued for ending discrimination, ending racism, changing laws. He argued for opportunity in education, employment, labor unions, full and equal participation in American life. He critiqued a progressive era that seemed to be steadfastly committed to drawing lines of exclusion for Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans. He also argued for cultural pride, that you should be proud to be African American. You shouldn't try to discount your heritage, your contributions. He argued African Americans have fought in every war in our history from the Revolution through today, that they are contributors to American society. They deserve a place under that umbrella of we the people. So this third element of the progressive era is a way of, again, complexifying this period. It's certainly a way in which we could think about the broader themes of this class and this question of who is an American. This third element of the progressive era is the way in which racial minorities were left out of reform. And we've given some examples here. Jim Crow, did Indian Act. But that exclusion was met by this fierce critique of Du Bois, who set in motion a cause for inclusion that, again, we'll talk about in many lectures to come. So the progressive era is a complex animal. It's one in which, a period in which, where things change, and sadly, tragically, things don't change. It's a period of change and continuity, and one of the elements of continuity is the way in which racial discrimination and exclusion continued and actually intensified in this period. We end our look at the progressive era with one more example of how things aren't changing in this period: eugenics. Eugenics was a mania in the progressive era. It was embraced by many people who saw themselves as progressives. It was seen as a remedy for many of the problems that plagued America, the problems that many progressives sought to solve. Eugenics came out of social Darwinism, not as a critique of social Darwinism. It came out of this idea that science could enumerate a pathway going forward, that science could be an agent, an instrument of progress and change. Eugenics was a false pseudoscience that, like social Darwinism, argued that some are fit and some are unfit. And if we could pass laws influenced by this way of thinking, we could solve the problems that plagued America. Eugenics demonstrates how social Darwinism doesn't die in the Progressive Era. It continues in a new form. The Progressive Era, as we've said, and now given evidence of, was a time that embraced science. Science as a handmaiden of change. Science as something that could create a better America. Science as a force for remedying problems. Put experts in institutions. Harness that power of reason, rationality. Make a more rational, legible, reliable American economy and society. Eugenics, like social Darwinism, claimed to be scientific. It's not scientific. It is a false pseudoscience. But it wrapped itself up in the mantle of science, and because of that, it persuaded many people. What was eugenics? Well, it was the idea that some people have good genes and other people have bad genes. And we can scientifically study human beings to decide whether or not they have good genes or bad genes, and then we could pass laws to discourage the people with bad genes from reproducing and encourage the people with good genes to reproduce, and over time, by having a population comprised of people with good genes, make a better America. And this way of thinking, eugenics, became a mania, sensation in the Progressive Era because it claimed to be scientific and it claimed to be, again, a way of solving the problems that so many people wanted to solve in this era. If we could stop the bad people from reproducing and encourage the good people to reproduce, well, America will be, again, a nation of progress. That was the thinking of eugenics. But eugenics in reality, much like social Darwinism, which was its antecedent and foundation, was a way of appropriating and misusing scientific imagery and ideas to justify racism, xenophobia. Eugenics will lead to immigration restrictions and efforts to prevent immigrants from certain parts of the world coming to this country, nativism, and preserving an America that worked for a few at the expense of the many. And this way of thinking flourished in the Progressive Era. This way of thinking that was rooted in social Darwinism, that advanced racism, exclusionary ways of thinking, actually got stronger in this period. Further evidence of the complexity of the Progressive Era and the way in which continuity continues in this period, even with the remarkable changes of this age. Eugenicists believed that they were doing scientific work, that they could scientifically study individuals and make for a better America. They advocated for laws, many of which we'll talk about soon here. Immigration restrictions, forcible sterilization laws, anti-miscegenation laws. They believed that if we could just simply put our laws in line with this false pseudoscience, we could make a better world. This is what happened in this period of the Progressive Era. Eugenics was this way of thinking. It claimed to be scientific in an age that people tended to gravitate towards science as a force for good, and then it led to laws that were passed in this period that were imagined to harmonize this way of thinking, the scientific, really false and pseudoscientific way of thinking, with our laws, with an eye for, again, the common good. First examples of this in the 1890s already. Laws were passed that prohibited certain individuals from getting married for fear that they may have children and reproduce. These laws, and you can see this is in quotations here, so this is the exact language of the law, said that imbeciles and feeble-minded people should not be able to get married because of this idea, well, they'll pass on their bad genes. Now, this is the exact language of it. That's why you see it in quotation marks here. But don't confuse these terms with the way in which we might use these today, the way in which we call any idiot, cut you off in traffic, an imbecile, right? I don't know what time of day you're listening to this lecture, but chances are you've probably already experienced many imbeciles in your daily life. I don't mean imbeciles in that way. At the time, that term, feeble-minded here as well, referred to people that today we would describe as having a mental disability. So these aren't just some idiot that cut you off in traffic or, is responsible for some daily misery that you may encounter. Instead, these are people that today we would say are suffering from some sort of mental disability. And what happens is in the 1890s, people like that are told you can never get married because of this idea that you are unfit, inferior, because some eugenicist has decided to persuade lawmakers to embrace such a law. And then in the early 20th century, in the Progressive era, anti-miscegenation laws are passed. Anti-miscegenation laws were very common in America in the first half of the 20th century. They will stay on the books in this nation for decades. In fact, the last of them are not removed until the mid 20th century, until 1967 in the landmark Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case. 1967. So these laws are adopted in the early 20th century, and they remain on the books until 1967, until very recently. I know this is a great shock to you. All these people listening to this lecture are so young, right? 1967 might seem like ancient history to you, but actually there are people alive today who were alive in 1967. This isn't history, this is their life. They lived in America where they could not marry people because of anti-miscegenation laws that were on the books until 1967. Anti-miscegenation laws that were put on the books, again, in the early 20th century, Progressive era. What's an anti-miscegenation law? What's a law that forbids whites from marrying certain racial and often religious minorities? That said whites can't marry African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, for again, this fear that their genes will mix. As I've said before, and I can't stress enough, eugenicists might have claimed to be scientific, but they weren't. They were anything but scientific. They were instead advancing a false pseudoscience that was really designed to justify racism. It argued that racial minorities, religious minorities have bad genes, and whites, Protestants, have superior genes. And so the anti-miscegenation laws were designed to prevent what was imagined to be the superior race, whites, white Protestants in particular, from commingling their good genes with the people who are imagined to have bad genes, racial and religious minorities. So state after state passed laws that forbid whites from intermarrying with racial and religious minorities in the so-called Progressive era. California had a very prominent anti-miscegenation law that prevented whites from marrying African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans. Most states had such anti-miscegenation laws. They were adopted in the Progressive era, and in some cases they remain on the books until 1967. But the most draconian of these laws, if anti-miscegenation laws aren't draconian enough, were the forcible sterilization laws that were passed in state after state that authorized states to force citizens of this nation to undergo tubal ligation, castration, or vasectomies. Vasectomies were actually pioneered by eugenicists to be a less intrusive form of male sterilization. The vasectomies that people get today, maybe you may someday get, a very common procedure, an outpatient procedure today. That procedure was actually pioneered by eugenicists who wanted a less invasive alternative to castration. That's another example of eugenics having such lasting influence in American life. State after state in the so-called Progressive era adopted these laws. And as we'll talk about in a moment, tens of thousands of Americans were forcibly sterilized by their government in the so-called Progressive era in the name of a better America. Who are the people most likely to be sterilized? Well, women and racial and religious minorities. That's what eugenicists targeted. In 1927, the forcible sterilization laws influenced by eugenics were challenged on a Supreme Court level in a very notorious, infamous Supreme Court ruling, Buck v. Bell. So these laws are established in the Progressive era. They are enforced. And then eventually, in 1927, the laws would be challenged in this case that immediately concerned Virginia's forcible sterilization law, as the litigant in this case came from Virginia, was a citizen of Virginia. But when the Supreme Court decided to hear this, they would thereby weigh in on all such eugenics influenced forcible sterilization laws? Because most states in this country adopted them. The Buck in Buck v. Bell concerned Carrie Buck, who became pregnant and was ordered to undergo tubal ligation because the state of Virginia declared her, this is again the language, you can see it right there in the quotation, a genetic threat to society. Isn't that wonderful? I hope someday the state of California will declare Michael Hawkins a genetic threat to society. I'd love to have that on my resume or just, a plaque in my house, right? But as absurd as this is, you can see a lot in this language. What the state of Virginia was saying in justifying sterilizing Carrie Buck was that your genes threaten society. It's very demonstrative of eugenics ways of thinking. It's saying that your genes are a threat to us all. Now, Carrie Buck became pregnant and was raped, actually, to become pregnant. She didn't voluntarily have sex out of wedlock and become pregnant. She was raped. So that's the first way in which she was a victim. And then the state of Virginia declared her mentally unfit to raise the child. And therefore the child had to be raised in a state-sponsored orphanage. And this is usually how you became subject to a forcible sterilization law. You in some way came into the purview of government of the state. You were arrested for a crime. In this period, if you're arrested for a crime, a eugenicist may give testimony at your trial saying, I've examined the family tree of this individual, and his father was a ne'er-do-well, his grandfather was a ne'er-do-well, and so he has bad genes, and I think as part of the sentence, he should be forcibly sterilized. And so if you were convicted of that crime, you would be forcibly sterilized. Or in the case of Carrie Buck, she in some way came under the purview of the state in the way in which her child was taken from her because she was declared to be intellectually, mentally unfit to raise the child, and therefore the child became a burden to the taxpayers of Virginia, and therefore you're a genetic threat to society. Carrie Buck had a normal IQ. She was not in any way intellectually challenged or deficient. What often happened with eugenics was it again targeted people who are already marginalized or people who already had very little social or political power. Women who had children out of wedlock were considered promiscuous, and again, set aside the fact that Carrie Buck was raped. She did not voluntarily become pregnant. And also, again, racial and religious minorities, people who were seen in society as somehow threatening. They're the people who were targeted. Well, this effort by the state of Virginia to sterilize Carrie Buck went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, almost unanimous, upheld the right of Virginia and all states in this country to sterilize people, all in the name of progress. Writing for the majority, writing for the 8 justices who voted accordingly, the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, in his opinion, stated that Carrie Buck is an imbecile, again using that term as it was applied legally in this period to refer to people with mental disabilities. Her mother and grandmother were all mentally deficient, again in the language used by Holmes and other eugenicists in this period. And therefore, we need to sterilize Carrie Buck. What this evidence is that Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice, was deeply influenced by eugenics. It's, again, further evidence of how this way of thinking permeated American society, influencing the Supreme Court Justice, who ruled, along with 7 other justices, that Carrie Buck and tens of thousands of others need to be sterilized to make a better America. Carrie Buck was sterilized. She lived for many more decades. She died in the 1980s. It's another way in which what I'm talking about here is not ancient history. Though these laws were established in the Progressive era, their impact continued for decades. And certainly it did for Carrie Buck, who could never have children. She lived for years and years, decades. She died in the 1980s. And she always expressed her great frustration, sadness, misery that she could never have children of her own. And she was not alone. Between 1907, when the first of such laws were established, until 1963, when the last of these forcible sterilization laws were overturned, over 64,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized by their government. This happened in this country in the name of progress. You know who's a big fan of eugenics in America? Adolf Hitler. In 1925, Adolf Hitler published his book Mein Kampf. And in that book, he cites America as this great leading force in the cause of a better world. And he cites eugenics and forcible sterilization laws as evidence of that. Now, we tend to think of such efforts as efforts spearheaded by people like Hitler and the Nazis. They're the ones who prosecuted the Holocaust. They're the ones who executed millions of people. But they were influenced by something that preceded the rise of Nazism in Germany, American eugenics. And you could see it right there on the pages of Mein Kampf. Guess what state sterilized the most? Got to be Texas, right? You know, they're punitive down there. They'll give you the death penalty for jaywalking, right? No, actually the state that sterilized the most by far? Yeah, your state of California. There you go, California. We're number one. We're number one at cutting your balls off, right? This might surprise you because today we have this vision of California's hippy-dippy California as we all drive around in our Priuses with our coexist bumper stickers. You know, today California is often represented as a very liberal place, blue state, left coast, but actually, if you look at the state of California the last 100 years, it's a very conservative place. This is the place where the modern conservative movement was born. It's the place of Richard Nixon, the adopted home of Ronald Reagan. Up until very recently, we were a red state. We had Republican governors. I know, one signed my diploma, Arnold. And in the early 20th century, California was this very reactionary place. It was also a hotbed of progressivism, and that's why California, more than any other state, forcibly sterilized citizens in the name of a better America. So this last example of the progressive era should clearly indicate how, yeah, a lot of things changed in this period, but we're not far removed from the era of social Darwinism that prevailed in the Gilded Age. Forces of exclusion still prevailed. So let's recap what we've learned here. Progressive era was this moment where there was great mania, great enthusiasm for reform, a great belief that the way things are is not how they have to be. We began with William Dean Howells and his vision of a better world. It led to true change in politics, a new role for the federal government intervening, regulating the economy. It led to women's suffrage and the incorporation of millions of American women as voters and citizens of this nation. But it was also a period where things got worse for racial minorities because so many were left out of reform, not imagined as part of that nation, that society that was to receive progress and reform, not imagined to be part of that common good. And then we ended here with the most obvious example of how the specter of exclusion remains hovering over America in this period: eugenics, anti-miscegenation laws, forcible sterilization law, the terrible fate of people like Carrie Buck and tens of thousands of people like her. Change and continuity.